Hi, I'm Warren Littlefield, and this is my interview with Elaine Goodman at gogoodman.com.au.
When you were younger, what was your impression of TV? What did you and didn't you watch? And what's the earliest memory you have of thinking that television is missing something or something needs to be changed? And the funny thing is, coming from my perspective, is that Australia's first TV broadcast was the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, yet The Tonight Show was first broadcast in 1954. So America's obviously had a longer TV history than we have here in Australia.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, when I was a youngster growing up, I found it was kind of more fun to just stay home from school and watch TV than go to school. And for some reason, I think my mom was like okay with that. I think she enjoyed the company, and so I would just covet that time. And, school was okay. I had friends and all that, but it was more fun to watch the magic of the set. And my friend Stanley Campbell came by one day and said, "Hey, there's a rumor you're dead." And so I thought, well, I probably should pull away from the television screen and show up at school more often. And I did that, and that was fine. But so I had this early kind of connection to it, and thought then that in the Ed Sullivan years, I thought, well, this guy's got the greatest job on the planet. He just says, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," and presents all this wonderful entertainment. And I thought, that's amazing. And so my earliest memory was...
Were you old enough to remember the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show?
Sure, yeah. I huddled in front of the TV and watched the Beatles.
Wow.
And so that was a early childhood sense of how cool would that be to be a part of that. And then, life takes over and you grow up and you move forward, and I ended up going to a small liberal arts college in New York State, and I got a degree in psychology, and thought I would go to graduate school and be a psychologist. And then I thought, let's take a beat. I just, I think I'm going to just do a little work time before I throw myself into another round of getting a graduate degree. And I went back to and got in touch with that childhood memory of the world of entertainment, and just started as a gopher on a production. And it reignited everything for me, and I realized that I was going to be playing catch-up, right? That I was, that what I truly wanted to do was work in the world of entertainment and understand producing, and so that was my first job at Westfall Productions in New York City, and that's where I really learned my first round of skills as a producer.
So from that answer, I've got two questions. So were you more kind of, so I guess when you were younger, did you see the things that you wanted to change about TV, or did that come when you were older?
I think that came more when I was older. I think, Friday nights, as I got out of elementary school and into my early teens, it wasn't deep into my teens before I was a midnight rambler, but like Friday nights, watching the NBC Mystery Wheel, I was taken into a world of those characters and those dramas, and I loved it. And I would have 3 Red L frozen dinners that I would pop in the oven and lay out on a snack tray, and I was good for the night. I mean, I loved that experience. So I didn't feel then, at that early age, that I wanted to change it. I just wanted to devour it.
And the second thing is you got a degree in psychology. So from my experience, everyone that has an inclination to get into the entertainment industry, probably in general, has to be at least a little bit crazy. So having that degree, having that degree in psychology, did that help you kind of understand the different sides of TV and what different jobs were out there and the different kind of mentality you needed to get into the field?
Yeah, I think it was helpful. I mean, first and foremost, you want to have a good knowledge of literature, and that's the most essential skill. But I had a liberal arts education, so there was plenty of literature in my background, and I only continued throughout my career to continue to study great literature of the past and also of the present. But in the world of creating content, you are a marriage broker as a producer, and so you're trying to find these uniquely creative voices and have them meld into a team, and then it does take an entire village to put a production together. So all of that psychology of finding artists with vision, strong, uncompromising visions, and getting them to unite and work together as one to create a memorable product. The psychology comes into that constantly, and I think it's been a great tool to draw upon.
Before you became the head of NBC, which was, I think, late 80s or very early 90s, you were the executive, you were the comedy executive at the network, so that was in the 80s, deep in the 80s. Were you a fan of comedy?
Oh yeah, I loved it. As a little kid, I was always watching comedy reruns on television, and it was watching a comedy allowed you to have. You're surrounded by a family of characters, and the family I grew up in was fairly small, and it made my family larger. I felt a tremendous bond with so many of the characters that were on television. And, of course, my early years, I was watching all the Norman Lear comedies and wildly in awe of what Norman was able to do, the empire that he created, and the voices of those characters reflecting the world that Norman was living in. So yeah, I was a huge fan.
And this was the decade before Must See TV, when you were the head of comedy at NBC. Were there a lot of comedians? There were a lot of comedians coming out of the clubs in the 80s. That was the big stand-up comedy boom before the big sitcom boom of the 90s. And a lot of them were trying to get into Hollywood to get their own shows because there was that opportunity. Was America starting to take notice of comedy in all mediums, or was that always the case?
Yeah, they were. I mean, of course, The Tonight Show was always a wonderful way for audiences to discover fresh, young comedic talent, stand-up talent, and it was also a wonderful way for us to take notice and to develop. So we watched Jerry Seinfeld kind of hone his act out there working the clubs, and then from time to time appearing on The Tonight Show, and his voice just seemed to continue to emerge, and famously with his managers, we had a meeting, and they were like, "Well, what about Jerry?" And we were like, "Yeah, sure. Let's develop something with Jerry. Why not? We love his observational tone. that feels like it's a pretty unique and specific voice. And then Jerry hooked up with Larry David, and the world got Seinfeld.
So, before we move on, because the next question's quite a deep question, because I don't want to go into too much detail, because there is a book that I absolutely loved that you wrote in 2012, and I would love people to read that. So we're going to cover a couple of different things, but I want to ask, as the head of comedy and the head of entertainment, what did you actually do in your day-to-day role? Because obviously there's TV executives, there's writers that come to you, to the executives with ideas, and then do the executives have to run those ideas past you as the head?
Yeah, well, I would be in a lot of pitch meetings, but also I think what we realized is that the shift from the 80s to the 90s was becoming more of an age of choice. So the average household went from a few channel choices to dozens. And then, and rapidly, that went to 100 and 200 channel choices and more. So what we realized is that perhaps we had to get a better sense of who we were and who we wanted to be, and what was the type of audience we wanted to bring to our network at NBC, and what was the type of comedy and drama that we wanted. And we turned a little bit to our past in order, I think, to find our future. We looked at a show like Cheers, a sophisticated young adult comedy, and we said, well, that's kind of who we want to be. There was romance, there were great characters, wildly funny, and we said, you know what? Young adult, urban, college-educated, upscale, we want those voices on our network. And once you start saying we're less of the family sitcoms, because quite honestly, our competition had those shows, and they had a lot of them, and they did well with them. So we found an opportunity to distinguish ourselves in comedy with a Seinfeld, a Friends, a Frasier, of course being a spinoff of Cheers, and that became Mad About You, Night Court. We really became that young adult urban showplace for that audience could see themselves, and those all became cornerstones for must-see TV.
You became the head of entertainment at NBC towards the end of the 80s, and things began to change. As you mentioned, Fox came in as a network very late in the 80s, and they started off with The Simpsons, obviously. So there were now 4 big players in the TV wars, and you said dozens and dozens of other smaller stations as well. So I mentioned Fox got The Simpsons. There was CBS and ABC were going consistently with their lineups, and NBC started to come out of the shadows and began slaughtering these other stations. Now, your book, Top of the Rock, which I mentioned was published in 2012, explains this all in detail, and I read it last year. It's one of the best books I've ever read, because there's so many different characters in it. And it's all scripted. It's all interviews, so that's why I love it. I'm reading Judd Apatow's book at the moment, Sick in the Head, which is full of comedy interviews. So that's the kind of style that I'm starting to like. So I wanted to go in a different direction. Can you tell me about the feeling of power and responsibility in terms of your next move or two, not only affecting the TV viewing habits of Americans, but creating and authorizing shows that are still so embedded in the memories and hearts of people around the world today, and still gaining new fans off reruns? We're talking Friends, Seinfeld, Frasier, Will and Grace, which has now been rebooted, and I have a question about that later. Law and Order. These shows may be around for the next 50 years plus, and you were there right at the very start.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's, when you are in broadcasting, there's an honor and a privilege to that, and a responsibility. so and I think one of the great lessons, and I mention it in my book, that Grant Tinker, who founded the Mary Tyler Moore Company with Mary, Grant, when he came in as chairman of NBC, instilled in us this sense of respect the audience and good things will happen. And so the responsibility we felt was that we could elevate the narrative, the storytelling that we were doing, and the complexity of shows. It was time for that evolution of television if we wanted to remain relevant. And in listening to Grant and allowing our producers to do more complex shows, and to show more complexity in character development, it really did resonate with the audience, and it was very successful for us. So not only were we playing with a high level of quality, but we also got the quantity, the masses came with it. So I think that Grant gave us really excellent advice. He said, stop thinking about the audience out there as a bunch of alien beings. Think of them as yourself, smart young adult people who are looking for quality entertainment. What's going to make you go to the television set? Don't worry about some stranger that you don't know. And I think that we heeded that advice.
In that period where there is starting to become a lot of money involved in the TV industry, and I guess back then you heard about the money that the actors were getting paid, but the money wasn't the big issue. It was more about the content. Today, executives are much more worried about how much money they're spending on a show and whether it will be successful. Back then, you just focused solely on making successful television, and then that's what made you guys successful. So, did you ever second guess yourself, or were you confident most of the time in making decisions about these shows?
Well, that's an interesting question. We were.
Well, is there room to be confident in that role?
I think you don't want to get cocky, and I think that's really important. But you want a certain confidence in your strategy and a confidence in your goals, and then you are going to make mistakes. It's really important to fail. And the most important thing is that we learn from our failure, because it tells us when we've violated a pact with the audience, when we've maybe gone too far, when we haven't gone far enough, when we forgot that we should challenge the audience. So failure is a very, very important part of the learning curve and in the creative process. But ultimately, we had a confidence in our strategy, in a sense of who we wanted to be, how we wanted to resonate for that audience, and the audience rewarded us when we aimed high and we delivered. And more often than not, we stuck with quality, and they came, and they stayed. And that was wildly exciting. Really fulfilling. And so we seem to be ahead of our competition in kind of identifying who we were for that run in the 90s of our success. We had just figured that out ahead of our competitors.
Do you still sit back and watch reruns?
Yeah. I think any time of the day or night, Seinfeld is almost therapy. It's medicinal. I still laugh out loud. I love it. and it just helps you unwind from the pressures of the day, and as we watch the world collapse around us. I do watch some reruns, although we're in such an amazing peak TV world right now, and I try and stay on top of formats from all over the world. So I watch a lot of foreign language stuff as well. There's just so much content to consume that's outstanding. So I have quite an appetite, but it's hard to go back when there's so much right now today that's new and being made all over the world. And
for Netflix and different streaming services as well. It's not just TV.
Netflix, Hulu, HBO, Amazon, now Apple coming into the realm. Yes, there are over 60 platforms making original content. There's 500 scripted television series being made a year. It's phenomenal, and that's in the United States.
So I want to stick to these sitcoms that you authorized. What made these sitcoms so memorable? A lot of sitcoms came out of the 90s and not just from NBC. So what do you think made this era of comedy so historic? Is it to do with the relevance of the issues they covered? Is it to do with the actors or the personalities or the characters? What do you think it is?
I think it's probably all of it. You know, there was this explosion of stand-up comedy, from Jerry Seinfeld to Roseanne. Obviously, Cosby really led that whole trend, and Tim Allen. So there was a real desire to find fresh stand-up voices and give them a platform to let their voices be heard. And then there was also the kind of how do you capture a group of characters in a time and a place. Friends was that. What happens when you've left mom and dad, you're in the big city, you've got that first job, and how do you navigate that? What is that early phase of life like? Well, you know what? The way you navigate it is you do it with your friends. That's the only way you get through it, if you have each other. And that vision from Kaufman and Crane of their experience at that time in their lives proved to be wonderfully entertaining. Will and Grace, we thought, well, I had for the longest time, I had friends who were, gay and straight women, and their best friends were gay men, and I was like, well, why doesn't television deal with that? I know that relationship in real life, and why doesn't television deal with that? So I had a lot of pushback from my management about doing an openly gay character and doing that relationship, but there was magic in the pilot, in the casting, and in the execution. And when everyone saw what we made, they just embraced it. And it seemed at the time when we put it on, at the end of the day, you were just, it wasn't a platform that was a political show. It was about two people who loved each other and were there for each other. One happened to be gay, one happened to be straight. It was about that friendship, that unique friendship.
So what was the mentality behind, say, a show like Third Rock from the Sun, which had amazing characters, outgoing characters. The story was crazy. It was just weird, but it was hilarious because the characters were so definable.
I know, brilliant, and look at that cast. But I take no credit for really developing it. They did a pilot at ABC, and they were passing on it, and I had a great relationship with Carsey Werner, and from our success from Cosby, and they said, and we also did A Different World with them, and they said, look, it looks like ABC is going to pass on this thing, and it was because of its concept. It was unlike anything we had, and yet it was really smart and funny with a big, high concept. And I just said, well, you know what? This expands who we are. And how do I not take a shot at this? So they didn't feel the love from ABC. They kind of let their option expire, and the next day I picked it up to series, and it was an experiment, but one I was thrilled to do, and one that provided endless gratification. It's just a brilliant comedy that commented when they were at the top of their game on who we were from an alien perspective.
And a lot of these actors are legends in their field. Most are still working today. How do you feel when you see Matt LeBlanc coming out with a new show, like he's always got a show on the run, or the Will and Grace cast reprise their roles for a reboot? Are you still a fan of these actors above all?
Oh, I absolutely am, and Bob Greenblatt, who runs NBC, called me up and said, "Hey, we're shooting opening night of the new Will and Grace, and we'd love you to be a guest and come over and come onto the stage and be a part of that opening night." And that was it. Nothing could keep me away. I made sure I was in Los Angeles. I spent the night on the stage, and it was a wonderful trip down memory lane, and a great reboot because they so went right to the heart of not the past but the present, and that's where they played. And so I have tremendous fondness for the cast, and for the creators, and that was sweet of NBC to say, "Hey, come on over and be a part of this." So I celebrate that, and they've just been renewed, and I continue to say, okay, so I still have a little influence over on the NBC schedule. How about that? I can still see some of my fingerprints.
God, is that strange?
No, it's great.
It's great, cool.
It's great. Look, for me, I can look at the past because the present is so good for me. So I otherwise I don't think head-wise it's great to dwell in the past. I have a great past, but I think as a producer doing Fargo and The Handmaid's Tale, that's such a strong present life for me that it makes everything feel great.
Now, tell me about this must-see TV lineup and the general watercolor culture in America. Was it as noticeable in the 80s when The Cosby Show was at its peak and Seinfeld was coming in? And when did you start to notice this routine of people watching TV for 2 hours every Thursday night? And I was probably a teenager just as it was finishing, and then like now you can go onto the websites and watch shows if you missed it. So there's no chance of you ever missing a show. But back then, if you missed it, you'd have to wait for a rerun.
That's right. Thursday nights on NBC, 1/3 of America, over 75 million people watch Thursday night. From 8 to 11, a lineup of our 4 best comedies, and followed by LA Law, and then into ER. Really was for all those critical years, and so it was record breaking year after year after year. We we dwarfed the combined competition. We beat the combined three other networks by 50-60% margins. And what was wonderful is that at the water cooler, at the coffee station, the next day at work, like, you didn't show up if you couldn't be a part of the conversation. If you couldn't talk about what happened on Mad About You, Friends, Seinfeld, Frasier, ER, if you couldn't be a part of that conversation, you didn't want to show up for work. And it was an incredible experience to be on the broadcasting side of presenting that content, because everybody talked about it. And you go to the grocery store the next day, and people were trying to riff on the scenes they had seen the night before and trying to do setup lines and jokes from those characters. And you just went, oh, my God, they're watching.
So did
some of my most fun nights would be if I was in New York on a Thursday night. I would just walk the streets and peer into apartment buildings and look at people in their apartments huddled around their television watching NBC on Thursday, and I would be giddy.
So where did you see this Watercolor Culture? Was it the same at NBC with all the staff, or was it when you were at dinner parties or when you were just at social gatherings? Where did you see it?
I loved it. I loved when we felt it in the creative community, we felt it in our work environment, but what I would love is being in a public place. I loved being in the supermarket and listening to people talk about the shows. That's when I would, at 6 a.m. every morning, I would get ratings that would come out of a fax machine, and that would be one way to report, like, here's the number of people who watched. But it made it all real for me when I would be in a public place like a grocery store and hear people talk about the shows. That's when I was like, yes, real people. I'm listening, and they're watching.
Did you ever identify yourself to them, or just walk past and casually listen?
Nope, just walk past and grab a head of lettuce.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And you were also the head of entertainment at NBC when Johnny Carson handed over The Tonight Show to Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien started up on late night, so that was a changing of the guard. Did having new, younger hosts help with promoting these new shows, or was Johnny always involved in that comedy side, in that promotional side?
Well, it was a huge transition because, the king of late night was Johnny Carson for 30 years. So there was a lot of risk in change, and it looked early on like we hadn't made the right decision with Jay Leno. But we gave Jay time, we gave him support, and he ended up having multiple decades of a triumphant run. So that was, I think, if you're in a network job, any of these broadcast jobs, you must embrace change. It can scare you. It can scare the crap out of you. But you must embrace change, because shows have a lifespan, and you're going to have to make changes. You're going to have to look for it, be excited to make change, even though there's great risk. And I did. I think I very much learned in my network years to embrace the challenges of change, and for the most part, it worked out.
And when you speak about change, there is nothing. There are no comedians more far apart than David Letterman and Conan O'Brien. So that must have been a big change, changing late night as well.
Yes, we struggled with what we would do in that 12:30 slot after the Tonight Show, and at the end of the day, we went for a young, fresh voice who had virtually no on-air experience. But Conan was a wonderful writer and an observer, and we thought, well, it's not 11:30. It's not prime time. It's not 11:30. It's 12:30. The stakes were not as high, so roll the dice. Maybe there's an upside, right? And again, we were rewarded by embracing change, being patient. We had very short-term deals with Conan in the beginning, and he grew into the job because of his intelligence and his determination.
And I read a book from one of the producers of Jay Leno's Tonight Show before I read yours, a couple of books before I read yours, and he said the biggest change in the ratings was when they had Hugh Grant on the Tonight Show after he'd been caught in a car with a hooker, and he came on the Tonight Show to apologize, and that's when Jay Leno started taking off. Do you remember that moment?
I do indeed. We had been working aggressively on trying to go post Johnny and tailor the show for the strength of Jay. And a lot of subtle but important changes had been made. And we were still, we weren't number one. And we were looking for the Klieg light to say, look at us. And so that crisis happened. Jay called up Hugh Grant and said, look, if you cancel your appearance, I'll understand. But I will offer this. It's been my experience that if you deal with things, then the audience will be very forgiving and they'll get past it. And if you run and hide, it'll be prolonged. So I'll be fair, and I hope you'll come. And he said, I'll be there. And so it became a news story. Everyone was tuned in to see what the hell Hugh Grant was going to say, what was he going to do, what was Jay going to say. And after a outstanding monologue, Jay welcomed his first guest. Hugh Grant comes out. He sits down, and Jay goes, what the hell were you thinking? And that was it. Boom. We never looked back. For the next 20-some-odd years, Jay was number one.
Wow. And...
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, even around the world, that's when, I started watching Jay Leno probably in the early 2000s when my dad got cable television, so I was watching Leno and Conan from when I was 12 or 13 years old, and that's when, the shows starting coming over to Australia in the late 90s, we started getting all these shows, and these shows were going worldwide. Were you aware of the worldwide impact?
Yes, we were... we were more and more aware as we entered that era that we were bigger than just our country. That NBC owned the content and they were selling it all over the world, and audiences seemed to just be devouring it.
Now, 3 of my top 5, we've got probably about 6 questions left, so we're getting close to the end. 3 of my top 5 favourite 90s sitcoms are products of NBC, but only 2 got a mention in the book. Was The Fresh Prince of BelAir unlucky not to get a chapter? And can you tell me the story of when Will Smith rocked up to NBC?
Oh, well, that was really prior to the must-see era. And so I tried to focus more on the must-see, but Quincy Jones, the brilliant musician, composer, artist, and human being, Quincy Jones, comes in to do a pitch and says, so here's the idea we want to do. And I actually, because I watched Yo MTV Raps on MTV back in the day, I knew who Will Smith was, and Will wasn't in the room, and we just said, "Hey, we love it. This is a fun idea. Let's do it." We had to find writers. We found writers. We put it together, and then I said, "Look, here's really my only question: is like, can Will Smith act?" And Quincy said, "Well, we'll set up. We'll set something up." I said, because I'd like to do this, but he's got to be able to be in a scene, right? Mm-hmm. That hadn't been proven, and so Quincy set up at his house one night, and Quincy was at a black tie awards dinner downtown. We were at his house in Coldwater Canyon, and I think it was Quincy didn't show up till 10:30 at night. We were in his den, and then Will came in a limousine. I think he had to sign a deal in the limousine, and around 11 o'clock he strolled in, and we had him read sides from some other sitcom that he had been given and studied ahead of time and all of that. And he was so charming and so funny and so wonderful. I was like, okay, yeah, we're in. Let's do it. Let's make this show. And it was a great night.
Now, by the time Friends and Will and Grace finished up, the internet was an extremely popular place. Social media and YouTube were starting, and eventually streaming became popular as well. Are you a fan of streaming and watching things online, and did you think must-see TV would be maintainable into the 21st century?
Well, I think great content is maintainable into the 21st century. I think that's what people covet, and any number of ways that they can get it. It's accessible in lots of ways. I do The Handmaid's Tale, so that's a hit for Hulu as a streaming show, and so audiences have found it because it's great television. I think that there are many ways to get content now, more than ever before. But if it's great, you can find it. Audiences will find it, and that's certainly what's happened for Hulu and The Handmaid's Tale, which I can give you a little commercial and say season 2 will be available in Australia on April 26th on SBS and streaming on SBS On Demand.
Wow, you are on top of it. Oh, okay. Now I've got a question about that in just a sec as well. What's your opinion on reboots? The creators of Friends seem to be against it. Will and Grace seem to have done it successfully. Are you a fan of that nostalgia?
Look, I think originality is very important, but I tip my hat to the fantastic job that they did in placing the Will and Grace characters, that entire cast, in today's world with today's issues. So I think they did it very well. Look, I did a reboot of Fargo, and it propelled my producing career. But I didn't try and remake Fargo. All original characters and all original stories. So we honored Fargo, but we presented the audience with something that was a unique experience. Always in homage to the Coens, but something that was unique and a reason to not just rip off the past, but point to the future. So I think that you can get carried away with remakes. You want to be careful. originality will give you the biggest upside, but remakes also can, they can work. And there's a great example, as we both have said, in Will and Grace is probably one of the better, more recent examples of that.
Ever since you got into the TV world, you haven't left. You've executive produced, as you mentioned, Fargo and The Handmaid's Tale, and there's quite a list of different things you're executive producing on your IMDb page as well that are coming out soon. Is the TV industry similar to the medical industry in that once you get into it, you need to keep working to keep your life balanced?
Yeah, absolutely.
They say doctors keep working into their 70s and 80s just to keep that balance, keep them mentally challenged.
Yeah, look, it's addictive. I mean, it's wonderful. There's no 2 days that are the same, and right now, television is the hot medium. It's filled with Oscar-winning actors, writers, producers, directors, because of the complexity of the narrative, the complexity of the character development. Television is king. And so, yeah, there are some good award movies that come out late in the year, but look at the incredible volume of brilliant television that's out there to be consumed. It's the cool place to be. So for me, I can't imagine stopping because I'm having so much fun making this high-quality content. And I feel like the television shows that I do in Fargo or The Handmaid's Tale or the kinds of things I develop, they're like movies that are 10 or 13 hours long. They're not just procedural shows. They have scope, and that's exciting to be a part of the challenge of mounting that kind of content.
And do you find it? Have you ever found it hard to find new challenges since you were literally at the top of TV back in the 90s? Have you always found that aspect of fun in everything you've done since that time?
Look, it took me a while I thought that it would be an easier transition from everything I learned running a network and a really strong work ethic. I thought it would be an easier transition to successful producing, and it wasn't. It took me a while. But I think one of the reasons I still do it is I feel like I still am learning. I learn every day, and so that makes it fun.
Do you think comedy will always be a respected genre on TV? With so much drama and reality being produced these days, does comedy get left behind, especially when money is a much bigger factor than it was 20 years ago?
Well, it goes in ebbs and flows, right? But I think as the intensity of our real world ratchets up, the need for comedy is even greater. And so the comedies that can provide that relief, the comedies that are able to let the audience discover talent that they didn't know before and feel like, oh, that's my discovery. I found that person on my TV. That's not going to go away. Comedy there will always be a great need for it.
What does a guy who changed the world of television do in his spare time? If you have any.
I don't have a lot, but family, friends, food, and I read a tremendous amount of material. I'm always wanting the written word to take me to a place I haven't been to before, and yeah, and that my days and my nights are filled up that way. But last night in my apartment in Toronto, after watching a rough cut, I was reading a novel until 2:00 in the morning because I couldn't put it down.
Wow. And just before, because the last couple of questions are a couple of profiles that I want you to give me on two people that you worked a long time with. But before that, I just want you to mention that, Fargo's still has Fargo got another season coming, and The Handmaid's Tale has got another season coming out shortly too. And what else have you producing?
Well, Handmaid's Tale, as we said, April 26th on SBS will premiere year 2 in Australia, and while they haven't ordered a new season yet, I think it's fair to say they will. So we'll certainly be continuing with that, and FX has ordered another year of Fargo, and that'll just take us a while because there's so many demands on Noah Hawley's schedule. It'll take us a while to get to making that and producing that, but we'll do a 4th season of Fargo, and so we continue to plow forward.
Now, there's two profiles, as I mentioned, two people that I want you to talk about that were a big influence in your book. The first is Don Ohlmeyer, who passed away, I think it was last year, and he was a big part of your book. You guys seem to clash a lot. He came from that sporting culture, so he had a lot of confidence when it came to making decisions at NBC. What will you remember about him?
Larger than life, and Don was kind of fearless, and I think that's came out of his sports background. We did clash a lot, but I think one of the things that he brought out in me was, are you willing to fight for this? And so I had battles with him over ER. I had battles with him over Will and Grace. But
and he was very against Will and Grace too.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we made it. We put it on. We had a big hit, and so it endured. And so it forced me and my creative team at NBC to stand up and fight for something. And I think that's great programming came out of it. The process wasn't always pretty, and I didn't always relish it, but great programming came through that process.
And the second one and final one is Jim Burrows. Now, a couple of years ago, he directed his 1,000th TV episode. What do you remember? What do you remember about working with Jim? Is he as an outgoing character, or is he more reserved until he's on set?
Oh, he's delightfully outgoing, and there's no one on the planet in the history of the comedy medium who's ever achieved and excelled the way that Jimmy Burrows has. His brilliance, I think, is that not only is he directing the actors in front of the camera, but he's also has the language and skills and analytic ability to direct the writers as to what he needs on the stage. So he's looking forward at the actors, and he's looking back at the writers, and he's uniting them and able to get the absolute best. So he's very good with story, he's very good with character, and he's very good at getting both sides of the equation through the eyes of Jimmy Burrows to come together in the greatest possible way.
Absolutely perfect. Warren, you can't imagine how much my spine is tingling. This was a lot of fun. We could have obviously gone into more detail and been talking for 3 hours, but no one wants to do that, especially not at your time of the night. So thank you for giving me so much of your time anyway. And yeah, have you been out to Australia? Do you travel much? Do you get to see the reaction
I've actually never been to Australia. So it's still on my to-do list. It's on my list if I really should. Cheers.